So IgA nephropathy is what we call a glomerular disease. And the glomeruli are the filters of the kidneys. You're generally born with about 1 million nephrons in each kidney, and they filter the blood every second of every minute of every hour of every day. And in IgA nephropathy, IgA immune complexes get deposited within those glomeruli, those filters, and they trigger inflammation, scarring, and ultimately loss of kidney function. And it's a disease that predominantly affects young people. And when I first started, there were no treatments for this condition. And I remember a young lad talking in his 20s, saying that he remembers when he was given his diagnosis, it was like his world stopped, because he didn't know whether he could carry on his career. He didn't know whether he'd be able to work. If he couldn't work, could he afford a house? Was he going to be living with his parents? Should he carry on with his relationships? Because could he provide? Could he, was he going to be ill? Was his partner going to have to look after him? And this was a guy that was in his 20s. And patients don't often tell you that when you're chatting to them, because they keep it inside and take it home with them. But to hear patient after patient talking about the impact the diagnosis has had on them in terms of the way they think going forwards, particularly for ladies thinking, can I...
Hello and welcome to Meet the Medicine Makers. I'm Menashe, an early career drug discovery scientist, and this podcast shares real stories from the people behind how medicines are made, from early research through to real-world impact. Today, I'm joined by Professor Jonathan Barratt, Mayor Professor of Renal Medicine at the University of Leicester, and a leading expert in IgA nephropathy, a chronic autoimmune kidney disease. Throughout his career, Professor Barratt has worked across research, clinical care, international clinical trials, and regulatory advisory roles, helping shape the development of new treatments for kidney disease. In this episode, we'll explore what it takes to translate scientific discoveries into new medicines, the challenges of developing treatments for rare diseases, and the future of kidney disease research. John, thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
So my first sort of question is, how did you first become interested in kidney disease research?
Yeah, so I think it started for me at medical school. I was always interested in research. So in medicine, you have the opportunity to do an extra year of research in intercalated BSc, which I did. And I really enjoyed the laboratory aspects of research. And then during my medical school training rotations, I was allocated to a nephrology ward, and I loved nephrology. I loved the nephrologists. I loved how they practiced medicine. And that really cemented my idea that I wanted to look after people with kidney disease. And one of the most attractive aspects was seeing patients on the ward, examining them, talking to them about their history. And then patients would have a kidney biopsy. And what I would be able to do would be then to look inside their kidney, and see what was going on, see the changes in the cells within the glomeruli, within the rest of the kidney, look at the immunological aspect of disease, because when we stain a kidney biopsy, we're looking for complement activation, we're looking for immune complex deposition. And I could go full circle between talking to a patient, seeing how it is impacting on them physically, and emotionally, and then see what was actually going on in terms of biologically within their kidney tissue. And that kind of hit all the buttons for me. So I decided to be a nephrologist, and I knew I wanted to do research. And then an opportunity came up completely by chance to come down to Leicester and work with Professor John Feely, who was interested in IgA nephropathy.
And for those who might not be familiar, could you just give an overview of what IgA nephropathy is?
Yeah, so IgA nephropathy is what we call a glomerular disease. And the glomeruli are the filters of the kidneys. You're generally born with about 1 million nephrons in each kidney, and they filter the blood every second of every minute of every hour of every day. And in IgA nephropathy, IgA immune complexes get deposited within those glomeruli, those filters, and they trigger inflammation, scarring, and ultimately loss of kidney function. And it's a disease that predominantly affects young people. And what we've realized over relatively recent times is that it carries a very high lifetime risk of kidney failure. And so it is an important cause of kidney disease in young people. And when I first started, there were no treatments for this condition. It's a rare disease in countries like the UK. But as we move into East and Southeast Asia, particularly China, it becomes a very common form of kidney disease. And it's estimated that 1 in 4 people on dialysis in China are on dialysis because of IgA nephropathy. So it becomes a significant public health problem as we move from the west to the east.
That's a really interesting point. I never, because you hear about it again being a rare disease, but I didn't realize there were such differences. And is there any sort of understanding what could be causing these differences?
Well, in the large genome-wide association studies, we've identified now over 30 different genetic risk alleles. And what we see is those genetic risk alleles are far more common in the Chinese population, for instance, than they are in people of European ancestry. So there is clearly an increased genetic risk of developing the disease, but it's also likely to involve environmental exposure. So we're thinking very much along the lines of exposure to pathogens and potentially changes in the microbiota within the gastrointestinal tract may well be relevant. But we don't have a definitive answer. But there's a number of levels of circumstantial evidence to suggest that it's an interaction between the microbiota, the pathogens, and the mucosal immune system.
And I think you've sort of touched onto my next point. When people think about new medicines, they often think about pharmaceutical companies. However, the name of the show is Meet the Medicine Makers, and I believe academic research, like sort of understanding the genetics, understanding the interactions that you've just mentioned, are a key part of developing new treatments. So, where do academic researchers fit into the process of turning scientific ideas into treatments for
Well, I
you?
think academic researchers probably undervalue their role in this because they have the world-leading expertise in the disease area. They are usually doing the most cutting-edge research, and pharmaceutical companies and biotech are very interesting in accessing that. And so, half of the work I do in the lab is with biotech and pharma companies, helping to look at drug development processes and evaluating therapies, particularly because I'm a clinical academic, I have access to patient samples. And of course, that's invaluable. You know, if you want to look at the interaction of potentially things in the blood or the urine or the kidney, we are the people that hold those samples. And so I do a lot of work with biotech, particularly early phase studies, looking at potential drug candidates. Are they capable of engaging with their target? Are they capable of engaging with targets in the kidney tissue itself? So we run a lot of studies with human samples. We also have animal models, of course. And many of the pharma companies just do not have animal models, particularly of rare disease, because they're quite bespoke models developed internally that are not something you can just buy off the shelf from a CRO. So I think it's very important that we understand our value and that you can have meaningful and good collaborations with biotech and pharma if you plan and have the contracting done in the right way. And of course, the other opportunity is to take your ideas and develop a company and a drug yourself. Now, we don't do that so often in the UK, but certainly in the kidney area, Professor Moin Salim from Bristol, who's a pediatric nephrologist, has developed a company called PureSpring, which is looking at gene therapy. So I've worked with Moin. We've done some experiments in the lab. Moin's done a lot more work on this with his idea that you could use gene therapy for monogenic causes of nephrotic syndrome. But actually, what the first trial is, and we're recruiting at the moment, is a gene therapy for IgA nephropathy, where we are going to make the glomeruli resistant to complement activation by getting podocytes, which are a cell within the glomerulus, to overexpress an inhibitor of the complement system. So we are really at the cutting edge, certainly in the glomerular disease world, with Moen's PureSpring company looking at gene therapies, and that being, us looking in the IgA nephropathy population with a view to other diseases, perhaps even more rare than IgA nephropathy in the future.
And I mean, my next question is, you've worked in this space and we're now talking gene therapies where we're going to be actually sort of targeting the genetic component of this. How has kidney disease research changed across the years that you've worked across it?
So I've been in this field now for 30 years. And for 25 years of my career, nobody knew I existed. was nothing. Well, perhaps 10 people did who were interested in IgA nephropathy. There really was no interest. And then it's just absolutely exploded.
I
And
mean, why was there no interest, if you don't mind me asking?
so it was traditionally thought as a benign disease that
Mm.
didn't really cause kidney failure. And we transformed that with the work that we did with the UK Rare Kidney Disease Registry called RaDaR, which really mapped the natural history of this disease in the UK, showing that this was a significant lifetime risk of kidney disease associated with IgA nephropathy. So that was important. At the same time, we worked on how you determine whether a drug works in IgA nephropathy. So traditionally, you tested a drug across kidney disease, and the way you determined whether it worked was its impact on a doubling of serum creatinine or a halving of kidney function, end-stage kidney disease or death. And for a slowly progressive rare kidney disease, what that meant was you would have to do a trial for probably 5, 6, 7 years in a very large number of patients before you ever knew the drug worked. And that was just too high risk and too expensive. So pharma were just not interested. And what we did was working with the FDA, who've been really fantastic in promoting drug development in kidney disease, particularly rare kidney disease, is we were able to show that if you look at a change in protein in the urine at 9 months in around 200 people, that's a pretty good indicator that your drug is working and will protect kidney function over the longer term. So suddenly, you've got a smaller trial, you've got a trial that is affordable, and the companies became very interested. And at the same time, we got a better understanding of the pathogenesis. So it was a perfect storm. And so I have never been busier over the last 5 years. We have now got 5 drugs approved in the United States. We're going to have 14 new drugs approved, probably within the next 3 years, for a disease that was discovered in 1968. And for the first 50 years, there was nothing happening. And in the last 5 years, we've got these mass of drug approvals and clinical trials. And it's absolutely transformative for patients.
What was that experience like for you personally, from a very quiet, I guess, quiet period of no one really knowing your research or not really knowing the disease to like now there's all these new drugs being sort of potentially being approved and sort of all this research?
Well, I mean, it's been a whirlwind, to be quite honest. There's now so much interest, and I think IgA nephropathy is seen as an exemplar for rare kidney diseases in terms of get the approval process right, understand the biology, and show that you can deliver clinical trials. And what we did as a global nephrology community was show if we have the right trial, we will deliver patients. And in fact, we're delivering patients faster than we ever have done before to clinical trials. Because, of course, the worry was we had no track record in rare kidney disease of putting patients into clinical trials. And nephrologists had no experience of how to do that. And we've now shown time after time that we can do it. So let's move on to the next rare kidney disease and the next and show that we can do it again and again. Because what that will mean is we will have new drugs for patients with rare kidney diseases who previously have had nothing.
It sounds like you need to have had a lot of grit and resilience to keep working, because I'm sure there must have been a lot of challenges before you got to this sort of whirlwind of, activity. So how have you navigated sort of that experience throughout your career?
Well, I think being a clinical academic, I'm very fortunate that I see patients every week. And you'd only need to hear the stories of young people with kidney disease, particularly with IgA nephropathy, to realize the kind of trauma they go through, living with a disease, with the uncertainty of not knowing what's going to happen to them, the fact there are no treatments, and that the likelihood is they're going to end up on dialysis in their 40s or 50s. So we have for many, many years run patient days. And in fact, we ran one last week where patients came to Leicester and they all put lab coats on. And all the people in the lab ran different stations to show the patients the kind of work we're doing. And we've done that for many, many years. And it is just so uplifting being able to give patients hope and to be able to tell them that there is light at the end of the tunnel. We couldn't do that before, but they knew we were working hard to try and get there. And they gave us the inspiration to carry on doing what we're doing. And we were very fortunate to have a donor, Mr. Jimmy Mayer, whose son had IgA nephropathy, who gave us the financial backing to be able to work on this disease when as a researcher, I'm sure yourself, funding is a real challenge. And there are so many competing diseases and so many competing research groups that it is very unpredictable. Sometimes you may get funding, other times you don't. That's another layer of complexity. I mean, when I interview clinical academics, I say the most important skill for being a clinical academic is to learn how you deal with failure. Because I can put all my failed grants and rejected papers in a big pile, and the ones I've actually got are a much smaller pile.
Like the very, very small. And it does not reflect the amount of effort that you
No,
put into.
absolutely. And you can passionately believe it's the best grant you've ever done, but for some reason, it's either not the topical area that should be funded or someone has seen a flaw in it that you didn't see. So you have to be resilient. You have to accept that it's not personal criticism, that just sometimes there are things outside your control. And I think that's one of the most important things to teach young clinical and non-clinical academics is you have to just keep going. And if you believe in what you're doing and you've got an understanding of where you want to get to, that it's worth persisting.
I think any scientist will know the sort of failure it is, whether you're in the actual research, whether it's in funding, whether it's in all aspects. But I think your story is a story of once you get through a lot of that failures, you can then end up in the potential of developing a new medicine that can really transform so many people's
Yeah,
lives.
so my goal in my career was to finish my career having been involved in the approval of a treatment for
Mm.
IgA nephropathy. And now I'm getting quite greedy, which is good. And the wonderful thing is that we have been involved in the lab in the development of a number of these new therapies in a small way, helping their development, looking at preclinical studies. And that's really nice for the scientists who don't see patients, is to say, look, the work you did contributed to this patient you've just met last Sunday getting a new drug. And that kind of brings it home to them how important their work is, because often there's a disconnect between what you do in the laboratory and what it actually means for other human beings. And it's really important to remind people about that connection.
It is because I think if you're in the lab, like myself, is you're very disconnected from the end goal. So if something happens on this side, you don't realize the impact necessarily later on the line.
No, so the information day we had where patients absolutely loved hearing how much work was going on was just as valuable for the scientists who don't get the opportunity to meet patients, but for the patients to say to them, thank you for committing your career to studying my disease is incredibly important for the scientists. When you've done your third experiment and you've still got a different result each time and you think it should be reproducible and the replicates just and
They're not
something's
replicating.
yeah. And something's not worked, some solution has gone off and you're just trying to troubleshoot. And to realize actually that you can pin it back to that person you had a chat with um, a week or so ago is just great, I think.
And I mean, for you in your career, I'm sure you have had many of these moments, but have there been sort of a conversation or a patient that you've spoken with that's been like impactful for you?
Yeah, I mean, I remember one of the very first patient days we did. Part of that day was patients talking about having IgA nephropathy. And I remember a young lad talking in his 20s saying that he remembers when he was given his diagnosis, it was like his world stopped because he didn't know whether he could carry on his career. He didn't know whether he'd be able to work. If he couldn't work, could he afford a house? Was he going to be living with his parents? Should he carry on with his relationships? Because could he provide? Could he, was he going to be ill? Was his partner going to have to look after him? And this was a guy that was in his 20s. And patients don't often tell you that when you're chatting to them because they keep it inside and take it home with them. But to hear patient after patient talking about the impact the diagnosis had had on them in terms of the way they think going forwards, particularly for ladies thinking, can I ever have a family? Is that it? Am I not going to be able to have a family because the kidney disease will increase the risk? So understanding the personal impact of a diagnosis is, I think, really important and brings home the importance of being able to give these patients hope, tell them that actually we do having drugs that can control the disease, and actually you are going to be able to do everything you want in life. And actually, this is now going to transform what's going to happen. So I think that is, I always bring myself back to those, hearing those patients talking about how it's impacting on their lives. And it's not just what we see in the UK. I do a similar thing in the United States. And you hear over and over again, wherever you are in the world, the patients are having the same lived experience because it's young people. You know, you want to develop your career, think about starting a family, get a mortgage, all of those things. And suddenly you've got a chronic disease. And what does that mean for whether I'm going to be able to have a job? If my employer finds out, is that bad news? All of these things are really impactful in how people live and shape their lives.
But if we go on the topic of rare diseases, so rare diseases, they affect, compared to other diseases, relatively small number of patients. How have you found navigating the rare disease field? Like, how does that change the way you think about developing new treatments and new medicines?
So I think you need to make your case about the impact of this each rare disease. Each rare disease is rare, but collectively, I think it's between 10 and 15% of the population have a rare disease. They all have a different one, but they are significant as a group together. And therefore, we know in kidney disease from the work from Radar that if you have a rare kidney disease, you are far more likely to develop kidney failure than the general common causes of kidney disease. And because it affects young people, rare diseases affect young people, you're much more likely to live longer with kidney failure. And therefore, there's a real impetus to diagnose and treat rare kidney disease because you'll make a significant impact on the number of people living with kidney failure. So we need to understand the data to make our argument to funders, to government, to ensure that they allocate resource to the study of rare kidney diseases. And actually, rare kidney disease patients have a very loud voice, and patient organizations are incredibly motivated to raise awareness and to make sure that they are not forgotten. So I think it's very important, certainly when you're working as a researcher in rare disease, to develop links with the patient advocacy groups, because they will be your best friend. They will fight your corner. It's important anyway to understand the impact of the disease. You know, even if you're a basic geneticist studying the genetic mechanisms of a rare disease, being able to link that to the patients and to the patient advocacy groups allows you to then raise awareness of the work you're doing and be able to then leverage potential new funding opportunities. So I think that working together is incredibly important.
And do you have any advice on how to do that? Because it seems like you need to be able to be sort of collaborative, communicative, being able to build networks and connections. And I think that's not just applicable for this, but I think generally as a researcher and a
Yeah, I
scientist.
think as a young researcher, this is where mentorship is absolutely critical, I think. So if you're a young researcher, it can seem like a very big world out there with lots of people that you really need to connect with, but you have no idea. And I think here's where a mentor's really important to make those introductions for you, to be able to give you the advice about who you might need to speak to. And ideally, make that introduction yourself, either at a meeting, you know, face-to-face introduction, bring a young researcher into meetings that you might be attending, um, because it's very difficult as a young researcher to do this yourself. But the bottom line, what I say to everyone when I'm at a meeting is I've never heard of any senior researcher being upset that a young person comes and says, hello, I really like what you're doing. Let's face it, we all like a bit of ego massage, and and then talk about what they're doing and whether they can connect. So I think my advice, certainly when I'm talking to the clinical academics and scientists I look after, is when you go to a meeting, is have a strategy as to who you want to go and say hello to, and write it down. Know when they're going to give a talk, and go, or they're doing a presentation, and force yourself to go up, say hello, introduce yourself, tell them what you're doing, and have a question for them, and make those connections. And you'll be amazed how many opportunities may come out from being able to do that. And ideally, if you have a mentor at that meeting, get them to introduce you to the people you want to talk to. That is the key. My experience has been uniformly that people are friendly, collaborative, and are willing to chat.
I think mentorship is just key for any career, even outside of science. And what more in science when I think conferences, seminars, talks all provide great opportunities for networking. So we've touched a little bit about the research and some of the challenges, but you also the chief investigator of many clinical trials. You also have regulatory advisory roles. So are there any challenges in sort of translating discoveries into treatments that we haven't really discussed?
I think it doesn't happen overnight. Nothing happens overnight. You have more of an influence the more people know you. Whenever you work with a new organization, be it a regulator, be it a pharma company, be it with collaborators, we all size each other up, don't we? We all think, well, okay, what's this guy really like? Can I trust him? Does he know what he's talking about? Is he going to deliver what I ask? And that doesn't happen overnight. And you have to take time to develop those relationships. So I wouldn't suggest you go into something, so I want this tomorrow. That isn't how it works. You have to think about developing relationships, trust, mutual respect. And that's particularly the case when you're outside of your own country. You're in the UK. I do a lot of work with China and Japan. Those countries have a very different approach. It takes a lot longer to build trust. But that's the key, is to go in and think that these are going to be more longer term relationships where you build trust. You're sizing them out, they're sizing you out. And if you've got a great idea, they're not going to say yes and do it straight away. You need to build up the idea that you know what you're talking about and that they will do what you want. And actually, my experience has been that I've now been in this area for some time, is that I can come up with suggestions. So, for instance, all the clinical trials I'm involved with, there are blood and urine biorepositories now for thousands of patients. And that's a great opportunity for discovery science. We don't actually have good animal models of IgA nephropathy. But what we do have are clinical trials, which are highly regulated, and are the experiment we really wanted to do anyway. I want to block APRIL, the cytokine APRIL. So we've got a large phase 3 trial where there's a monoclonal that blocks APRIL. So I can then, if I collect the blood and urine, look at all the downstream consequences of that. And those are the experiments I'd really love to do. So once you're in a position and you've built that trust, you can then say to the companies, look, I think we should really look at the blood and urine and we should do these experiments because that's going to be really interesting. Now, sometimes they'll say no, but actually those are fantastic resources to be able to look at. And we've been able to convince companies to do what we call experimental medicine studies, where we have patients who are given, we have a kidney biopsy and lots of blood samples before they have the drug. They have their drug, and then we do kidney biopsies and repeat samples at a time down the line. We've now got data for one of our studies where we have single-cell transcriptomics. We have transcriptomic data on every cell in the kidney before and after treatment in the same patient, and we've got multiple. So we can now start working out the real biology of what this drug is doing, what blocking these pathways actually means for the kidneys. And this is giving unrivaled ability to look at pathways, relate that to tissue from other populations, and it is really transforming our understanding of kidney disease. And that's through working with the companies, but also working with collaborators. I work with Catherine Bull in Oxford, who's absolutely fantastic. Work with the guys at EMBL EBI in Cambridge for bioinformatics. We have a network of sites around the UK that do these studies with us. So it is a wonderful opportunity to take the most cutting edge technologies and apply them to kidney disease. And that's only possible with collaboration with the pharma companies who have sponsored the study and paid for it, but also through accessing a fantastic network of academic researchers we have in the UK and clinical researchers who deliver the trials. So that's what's the joy, in fact, of doing this, is you work with such wonderful people who all bring something different to the party. And and I think that's a really important lesson, is you are never going to be good at everything. And if you think you are, then you're in for trouble. But actually bringing together a group of highly talented individuals who bring different skills is where you're going to get the best output.
It really sounds that in rare diseases, it's a story of advocacy and collaboration. You need to be able to advocate for your research. The patients are advocating for themselves, and you need to be able to say, like, I have this idea, but at the same time, you have to be able to work with other people, take different perspectives, and sort of put that together to form a plan of, I guess, action.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think we have multiple examples of that in the UK, certainly in the kidney field, in terms of working very, very closely with patients. So, for instance, the Alport syndrome, which is a genetic cause of kidney disease, we now have, through a philanthropic supporter, the Alport Hub, which has brought together all the Alport expertise, working with Alport UK, the patient organisation, that is really making fantastic advances in the understanding of this disease. And we now have a very interesting new treatment that is coming along for a very specific form of Alport that was driven by the fact that radar exists and has all the genetic data for all patients with Alport. We could identify patients across the UK with those specific mutations, and we could deliver a trial that nowhere else in the world could. And that's because we had the expertise with radar, we had the scientific expertise with Rachel Lennon in Manchester and Danny Gale at UCL and Neil Turner in Edinburgh, and we got the support from a UK-based philanthropist, and we put it all together with Kidney Research UK, and we are delivering something that nowhere else in the world is delivering, which is just incredibly exciting.
It does sound honestly really exciting. And I mean, we're coming to the end of this episode, but so I just have a few final questions. I mean, looking back over your very impressive career, have there been any developments in this sort of kidney disease research that have surprised you?
Well, I never thought I'd be talking about gene therapy in I in IgA nephropathy even 5 years ago. So I think we should never discount any potential opportunity. So we're now very familiar with using RNA interfering therapeutics, so antisense oligos and silencing RNAs as treatments in IgA nephropathy. We've done a number of trials of those. That was science fiction 3 years ago. So I think you should never discount what might be on the horizon. So I think you have to keep an open mind.
But for someone early in their career who's interested in perhaps clinical research, such as yourself, or translational medicine, what advice would you give them?
So I think one of the most important is find yourself a good mentor. I think that's critical to give you advice and guidance. And for me, I always say, if you're offered an opportunity, try it. I've always tried each opportunity I've been given. Some of them, I realized I don't want to do that. I did it. I'm glad I did it because I knew that wasn't what I wanted to do. So if you're given an opportunity, always take it, in my view, and you'll find out what you like and you'll find out what you don't like. And it's as important to find out what you don't want to do as it is to find out what you really do want to do and what your passion is. So I always advise people, take the opportunity, even if it's something you've never thought you might want to do, and just test it out and see whether that's for you or not.
Mhm. And before we wrap up, is there anything you're currently working on that you'd like to highlight or share? And also, where can people go to find out more about your research, more about this disease?
So a lot of the work I do, I can't talk about because and that's really interesting because these are early phase kind of new therapeutics. Um, but one of the things I think we've just finished a trial looking at how we alter the gut microbiota as a potential way of treating this disease. And we've got in fact, we've got a meeting this afternoon where we're going to go through some very early metabolomic and metagenomic data. So there's a possibility here that we might be looking at new ways to think about this disease. And if people want to find out more, particularly about the impact on what IgA nephropathy is, we have our own YouTube channel, Leicester IgA Nephropathy. We have the UK Facebook group, which is very much for patients, but I the convener for the International IgA Nephropathy Network, and we have a research page. And the kind of research work we're doing on a global scale, you can find there if you put that into Google or whatever. And please, if anyone is interested after hearing this, please get in touch. My email is jb81@le.ac.uk, and I'm always happy to chat to people.
Yeah, as our sort of final questions, I always like to remember that people aren't just their work, even if it is really impressive work. So, what do you like to do outside of what you do professionally?
I do whatever my wife tells me to do, to be quite honest. But I do like listening to music. I like sport. I like spending time with the family. and when I get the opportunity traveling. But actually, I get lots of opportunity to travel in my job, and I just love meeting people and hearing about life in different parts of the world. And one of the things you realize when you travel so much is how very similar we are and how we have the same goals and aspirations. And even though the news and certain people are trying to drive us apart, we are in fact at heart the same type of people, no matter where we are. And actually, it's wonderful to see that you chat to people and they just want to do the right thing. And that just gives you much more confidence in the world than if you turn the news on, quite frankly. So I think that's a real luxury of my position now, is that I do get to travel to Asia, to South America, to America, and you just meet so many lovely people. You realize actually, uh, people at their heart are decent human beings who all want the same thing.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we all have very, very similar DNA. So I think we are the same on the inside. Oh, John, thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation. I think I've learned so much about kidney disease research and sort of about your career in this field. So thank you for taking the time to share your experience and perspective.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
And thank you for listening to Meet the Medicine Makers. This podcast explores the people behind how medicines are made, from early research to real-world impact. If you found this episode useful, feel free to share it with someone who might benefit, and you can find out more information about John and his work in the description. See you in the next episode.